Stephen Colbert opened the segment with his trademark smirk, easing into what seemed like a routine monologue before Pam Bondi's appearance. The audience, as always, was energized, clapping and laughing on cue. But then, he leaned forward, his tone shifting slightly, just enough to signal that something sharper was coming. "Joining me tonight," he began, "is a woman who's made more court appearances than most lawyers I know, not always in the way you'd expect, Pam Bondi." The crowd laughed, unsure if it was a compliment or a jab. Before Bondi had even walked onto the set, Colbert had already set the tone. She entered confidently, a controlled smile on her face, waving lightly at the audience before settling into the guest chair. Colbert, still riding the energy of the previous joke, leaned in again. "I have to say," he quipped, "when I heard you were coming on, I made sure the legal team was on standby, just in case." The audience erupted again, this time with louder laughter, sensing the tension underneath the joke. Pam remained composed, but her smile tightened ever so slightly. The camera panned briefly to the crowd, some viewers chuckled awkwardly, others raised their eyebrows. Colbert continued without missing a beat. "Pam, you've been involved in some, let's say, interesting legal moments over the years. Florida's finest, huh," he added with a wink, referencing her controversial involvement in past political investigations. He was clearly trying to corner her with wit, but Bondi didn't flinch. The crowd's laughter was now mixed with murmurs, some surprised at how directly Colbert was going at her. His tone, though couched in humor, had an edge. It wasn't just comedy anymore, it was calculated. What made the moment even more intense was how confidently Colbert played to the audience while subtly prodding his guest. "You've got to admit," he said, "it's not every day we get someone on this stage who's been both a prosecutor and a headline." The underlying message was clear, he was challenging her reputation while entertaining the crowd. Pam's hands folded in her lap, still composed, but the slight narrowing of her eyes revealed she was no passive participant. The atmosphere was shifting. Colbert had kicked off the evening with a punchline that landed, but no one could have predicted what her response would ignite next. Pam Bondi didn't rush her response. She let the laughter die down, allowing a brief silence to fill the studio. Then she looked Stephen Colbert straight in the eye, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. "Well, Stephen," she began with a smooth, measured tone, "I've been called a lot of things in my career, but I've never been called afraid to speak my mind." Her voice was calm, confident, not defensive, but assured. There was no hesitation in her delivery, and her words were deliberate. The audience quieted noticeably, unsure whether to expect a joke or a jab in return. Colbert tilted his head, intrigued, maybe even slightly amused, waiting to see what she'd say next. Pam continued, her southern cadence subtly adding weight to her words. "I've been in courtrooms, on TV, in political crossfires. I've learned that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything." The statement wasn't just for Colbert, it was aimed at everyone watching. There was a pause. Then, a few claps echoed from the audience, not many, but enough to signal a shift. The studio energy changed from light ridicule to cautious attention. Pam adjusted in her seat, still perfectly composed. "I didn't come here to win a popularity contest. I came here because I believe in having the hard conversations, even if some folks in the room would rather make punchlines out of them." Her eyes didn't leave Colbert's. That line landed harder than anyone expected. The studio fell into a deep stillness. Colbert raised his eyebrows slightly, impressed more than offended. For a brief moment, he didn't have a comeback ready. Bondi leaned back slightly, letting her words settle. "Humor's a powerful thing," she said softly, "but it loses its charm when it's used to cover up real debate." The message was direct. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't rattled. She had flipped the dynamic without raising her voice or losing her cool. The crowd, sensing the gravity of her tone, stayed mostly silent, not quite sure whether to applaud or wait for Colbert's reply. But one thing was clear, she had taken control of the room with nothing more than her words. Stephen Colbert shifted slightly in his seat, the usual rhythm of his show momentarily disrupted. He reached for his mug, taking a slow sip, buying time. Pam Bondi sat poised, her earlier remarks still echoing through the studio. The audience, usually quick to laugh, now watched in near silence, unsure which direction things would go. Colbert tried to regain the upper hand, flashing his signature smirk. "Well, Pam," he said lightly, "it sounds like you've been rehearsing that one for a while." A few people chuckled, but the laughter wasn't as full as before. The crowd sensed something different. Pam didn't react. She just smiled, calm, confident, and slightly amused. Then she leaned forward, voice unwavering. Rehearsed. No, Stephen, just lived. The audience murmured again, this time louder. Some clapped. Some gasped. Bondi wasn't playing defense anymore, she was rewriting the tone of the conversation. See, what's interesting, she continued, is how selective outrage works. Some people get endless airtime to criticize others, but when they're challenged, even respectfully, it's suddenly called, rehearsed. She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried weight. The message was clear, and the crowd felt it. Colbert tried to pivot, throwing in a political joke to bring the audience back to laughter. You've gotta admit, your party isn't exactly famous for nuance. A few people chuckled again. Pam nodded slightly. And yours is famous for applause lines that avoid accountability. A low, ooh, rippled through the crowd. The energy was shifting again, this time not from jokes but from tension, challenge, and unexpected honesty. People were now paying closer attention, and some audience members who had laughed earlier were now nodding slowly, recognizing her control over the room. Bondi continued, her tone steady. The problem isn't disagreement, it's the lack of space to have disagreement without mockery. I don't need everyone to agree with me, but I won't sit quietly while my perspective is reduced to a punchline. She looked out at the audience now, not just Colbert. A young woman in the front row clapped slowly, soon joined by others. Colbert smiled politely, masking the realization that this exchange had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. Bondi had done something rare on late-night television, she turned the crowd, not with jokes, but with dignity, poise, and unshakable confidence. Pam Bondi took a moment, scanning the room before speaking again. There was a noticeable shift in her tone, not louder, not angry, but more deliberate. Her voice carried the kind of composure that could silence a crowd without force. She looked directly at Stephen Colbert, and then she said, I came here for a conversation, not a comedy roast. The effect was immediate and undeniable. The room, once bubbling with laughter and snarky jabs, fell completely still. Not a single clap, not a single chuckle, just silence. The kind of silence that hits when a truth lands too hard to ignore. Colbert's smile faded just enough to show that the weight of her words had registered. He blinked and leaned back slightly, hands folded, as if re-evaluating his next move. For a man known for his quick wit and endless comebacks, he suddenly had nothing to say. The audience watched, frozen in the moment. You could hear the faint creak of a camera shifting, a cough from someone in the back row, and then, nothing. It was as if the air had thickened. Pam didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or posture. She simply held her ground. The power in her silence said more than any insult ever could. She had reclaimed the space. Not with aggression, but with self-respect. Colbert, known for skewering guests with humor, now found himself in rare territory, having to decide whether to keep joking or pivot entirely. The audience was watching him now, not for laughs, but for how he would respond to this shift in dynamic. He cleared his throat and offered a diplomatic, almost respectful nod. Fair enough, he said, his voice softer. It wasn't defeat, it was acknowledgement. In that moment, Colbert wasn't the host of a comedy show. He was a man who realized he had underestimated his guest's composure. Pam remained still, her eyes fixed on him, not in confrontation, but in quiet resolve. The entire studio seemed to pause, caught between entertainment and something much more real. It was a moment of rare television tension, unscripted, unfiltered, unforgettable. Pam Bondi took a breath, glanced at the audience, and then spoke with a calm, measured rhythm. When you've spent years in the public eye, she began, you learn quickly that criticism is part of the job. But when the criticism becomes performance, it loses its value. Her voice was firm, not defensive. I've made decisions that not everyone agrees with, sure. But I've stood by every one of them, not because they were easy, but because they were right for the people I served. Her words echoed across the studio. The audience, moments earlier bursting with laughter, now sat locked in attention. She adjusted in her chair, her expression steady, her tone grounded in experience. I didn't come here to trade punchlines or defend headlines, she continued. I came because I still believe that somewhere between sarcasm and silence, there's a place for real dialogue. Her delivery was so confident, so precise, that even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't help but listen. One by one, hands started clapping, not in unison at first, but slowly, authentically. Then louder, then stronger. Stephen Colbert, watching it unfold, blinked. His show, usually a stage for controlled chaos and witty monologues, was now witnessing something rare, a guest turning the room not with comedy or charisma, but with sincerity. Colbert gave a slight nod, acknowledging her strength, his usual armor of satire temporarily set aside. "You're full of surprises, Pam," he said with a half-smile, clearly impressed, if not fully persuaded. Pam gave a soft smile in return, but her gaze didn't waver. "You call it surprise. I call it being underestimated." That line hit with precision. The crowd responded with cheers this time, real cheers, not canned applause. People stood up in small clusters, clearly moved by her command of the moment. What began as a segment designed to corner and poke fun had turned into a moment of unexpected respect and intensity. As the noise settled, Colbert leaned forward again, this time not as a comedian, but as a man intrigued by the shift he had just witnessed. "Well," he said, "this did not go the way I planned." The audience laughed, genuinely, warmly, almost with relief. The tension had broken, but the respect lingered. Pam Bondi, once the subject of sharp jokes and subtle digs, had walked into the lion's den and left the crowd, studio and beyond, speechless, then standing.